Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. All over the nation, many families are celebrating a graduation. That's why in this podcast, we invited Pete Peterson, Dean of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with Dean Peterson about what it's like to run a public policy school and his goal to graduate students who are well-grounded in the founding principles of America. And in this age of political correctness and safe spaces, Dean Peterson also discusses his views on the growing lack of tolerance for the diversity of viewpoints and protecting free speech on campus. Thanks for joining us. Dean Peterson, thank you so much for joining us at our PRI's podcast. So you've been Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy for about 2 years now. Talk to our listeners about the challenges and the rewards of leading a School of Public Policy.
Well, I'm in a very fortunate place to be the dean of a program that I myself went through. So I graduated here from the policy school about a dozen years ago. I came back to graduate school a little bit later in life, my late 30s in my case, and it was a life-changing experience. This is a unique graduate program that's really more of a liberal arts degree that is combined with a professional degree in this Master's of Public Policy. And for me, as someone who had been in the private sector for many years, to come back to graduate school and have a chance to study through history and political philosophy, along with the quantitative aspects that you would see in most Masters in Public Policy programs, was just a great experience. And like I say, for me, was life-changing. And so to come back now as dean after doing a lot of work in public engagement and working at the state and local government levels is a blessing. And I'm really excited about, because we live in a time both here in California and nationally where the relationship between government and citizens is under fundamental strain. And one of the phrases that we use here at Pepperdine is that we're about putting the public back into public policy. And so in that, it's a great time to head up a program that I think really my goal for it is to make it more nationally known as a program that really is about preparing public leaders and not just bureaucrats.
Well, one little known fact about me, I actually applied to the Pepperdine Public Policy School when I was graduating from college in 1998, and I think it was either the first or second year. Thought about it and was trying to think of what path do I want to go down, and ultimately I decided to embark on the wacky world of state politics and state government here in Sacramento.
Well, it's great to be reconnected here, but you're right. We're in our 20th anniversary year. So we launched in our first class we welcomed in the fall of 97. So yeah, that really would have been in the first year or two of the program itself.
It's May, and it's sort of 'tis the season for graduations, and already and in the coming weeks, thousands of public policy students across the country are going to be graduating and walking across the stage and receiving their degrees. What's your message to these students? What kind of career advice do you give them as they embark on careers in government and think tanks, or perish the thought, even a run for office?
Well, you raise a great point, Tim, and it certainly is something that we think about in our program. I know the Master's in Public Policy degree is one that's seen as purely a government degree, and it's really not, certainly not in the way that we teach it here at Pepperdine. We understand it much more to be what we would call a cross-sector degree. And so for our students, when we look back over, say, the last 5 years or so of our graduates, it's almost a third, and a third of our students go out for career paths either in government and the public sector, and that can be at all levels, whether it's local government up to Capitol Hill in the State Department. Another third will actually pursue careers in the private sector that has some sort of government connection, whether that be communications, government relations type positions, land use and planning companies and firms. And then another third will go into careers in what we would call the civic sector. And so nonprofits ranging from think tanks, as you say before, to policy-related nonprofits that are working on issues from education reform to homelessness. And so really what my advice to graduates of all policy programs is to really consider your degree as a preparation, not simply for work in the government. And we need smart and good people to be working at government at all levels, but also just to to think about the many ways in which policy is made. Policy is formed not just in government, but through the influences of organizations and think tanks like PRI, but also other civic and private sector organizations as well.
And I can attest, too, to the fact that getting a degree in public policy, or I'm an MPA graduate from USC, it's a very user-friendly degree, and I found that it's very applicable to the work world. And I've put to work in my past life working in state government the principles that I learned at school, especially for things that you may not think about, like how do you motivate public employees when you can't really hand out bonuses and stock options and, give more vacation time and things like that.
No, you're exactly right, Tim. And you can extrapolate that same set of principles over to the nonprofit sector. How do you motivate volunteers in a way that you don't have the same levers that you have in the private sector? And I think if there's anything that our friends in the business school world don't I think appreciate fully, is that the management skills you need in the public sector and the nonprofit sector are quite a bit different than what you would see in the private sector. Understanding those, and at the same time also understanding, and there's a lot of data coming out now that looks at the fact that this millennial generation and my generation, I happen to be on the front end of the Gen X generation, that our careers themselves will become more multi-sector, that over the course of a 35 or 40-year career, chances are many of us will be spending time in a nonprofit for some point, and the private sector as well, and maybe even some service in or with a public sector agency or organization as well. And so that is a very particular set of skills and things you need to know that I think a graduate policy degree really prepares you for.
Dean Peterson, PRI Sally Pipes was honored to receive an honorary degree from the Pepperdine School of Public Policy this past spring. One thing that struck us in watching the commencement ceremony was the embrace of free market principles from the university leadership and even in the curriculum. Mm-hmm. That seems to be an exception to the rule these days. What makes Pepperdine different? What experience have you had on campus in teaching and discussing free market ideas among this major leftward push in America's universities?
Well, I'm glad you picked that up, and it was delightful to have Sally here on campus and award her our 2018 honorary degree. Pepperdine actually has a much different founding story than most graduate policy schools, in that we were founded by a group of people like the late Dr. James Q. Wilson, Congressman Jack Kemp, Michael Novak, the political philosopher. In that interesting group of people, Kevin Starr, the late great historian of California. What made Pepperdine unique, and now in our 20th year, I think we've held true to that founding, is that we've realized that a public policy degree really should be seen as more of a public leadership degree. And public leaders need to be formed not only in understanding what government can do, but what civil society and the private sector can do as well. And so we certainly take more of what might be called a classical liberal or classical conservative view of the role of public leaders and the role of citizens. As I said before, one of the phrases we use here is we're about putting the public back into public policy. Well, that's quite a bit of a different perspective than you see in most graduate policy programs that, for the most part, are about preparing experts who go out and tell the public what to do. From our beginnings, we've always understood that we're dealing not with just a mass of humanity, but with individuals. And in that, we're dealing with human nature, and in that, we're dealing with a particular history in which people work. And so the policy solutions that might work in Santa Monica are not going to be the ones that work in Fresno, California, are not going to be the ones that work in Baghdad, Iraq. And so it's very important for us in our curriculum to incorporate not just the quantitative aspects of policy analysis that you'd see in the vast majority of policy programs, but we also have coursework in the founding principles, in political and economic philosophy, because we know that when we send people out into the workforce to work at all levels of government and nonprofits and in the private sector, that many of the public challenges they will face will have unique elements that are connected to basic historical and philosophical principles. And so when people see us as more of a center-right program, I think it's really because we take more of this liberal arts approach that understands that when we think about free markets and the role of the private sector, we understand that from a perspective that the private sector is an essential part of not only a growing economy, but of responding to many of the public joint challenges that we see. And so in that, we not only teach Adam Smith Wealth of Nations, but we also teach the theory of moral sentiments, right? To understand that an unbridled market is not something that we should be supporting, but at the same time, a free market approach, and one that puts the emphasis on individuals and the public, is a set of policies around which we really should be preparing leaders to support.
Well, it's been a while since I've been back on campus, but there's certainly, I recall from my time in the academy and certainly reading up on things these days, that our college campuses are certainly bastions of liberalism. And ideological diversity is a real concern for many. You know, in some cases, students are, now I didn't have this problem, and maybe that was my good Jesuit education at Santa Clara, but, you know, in some cases, students are intimidated in the classroom for expressing free market views. So how can we balance the principles of academic freedom with the spirit of open and thoughtful discourse that I would hopefully all agree that we want to encourage?
This is a great question, Tim. It's being called viewpoint diversity, right? How do we support greater viewpoint diversity on college campuses? An environment that is supportive of diversity in all these other areas. And I don't besmirch that. I think we should have diversity in how we're recruiting professors and students. We should have that diversity, whether it be ethnic diversity or racial diversity. We should definitely have that on college campuses. But what I'm seeing is something that I think is actually much more problematic, is a lack of viewpoint diversity, that we aren't having really good conversations around vital and I would argue foundational issues of how we relate to one another in a democratic republic, civil discourse, how do we handle disagreements, and around these issues, whether it be free markets or America's founding and founding principles, America's role in the world, all these extremely vital questions, especially here at a policy school, more than a business school or a school of psychology or many other graduate programs. These policy programs are about putting people out into the public square who are going to be leading and convening these conversations. And if they're not able to have the skills to handle disagreement, then we are really hurting ourselves as a nation and hurting our local community. And so some of the work that we do here at Pepperdine is very focused on how we improve and increase viewpoint diversity. And so I do a lot of speaking on college campuses around what is becoming this viewpoint diversity movement. There's now a bipartisan organization that was started by a professor at NYU. His name is Jonathan Haidt. He created an organization called the Heterodox Academy. And what started with a bipartisan group of about 20 professors has now grown to over 1,500 American faculty members across the country, left, right, and center, who have come to the agreement that the pendulum has swung far too much to the left in preventing not only good civil discourse and disagreement in the classroom, but as research is beginning to show, social science research and what is possible to be investigated. Some of those questions are actually being squelched because some see the possible outcomes of that research to be too politically sensitive. And so I really think this is a major challenge in our 21st century to how we take an institution, in this case higher education, that is so vital to preparing citizens and leaders, and how we create spaces, if you will, that can handle and prepare people to work through disagreements, which we're inevitably going to have in the public square. But I'm seeing some great signs, because you're seeing people from across the aisle, and academics and scholars specifically, come together and say, this has gone along far enough, we need to make some changes here. So I am hopeful, but this next decade is going to be very significant in how we can make our colleges and universities a place where we're forming people that can handle and work through disagreement.
As a follow-on to your response, we're seeing a troubling trend that when students disagree with the views of speakers who come on campus, they've been threatened by unruly mobs, even acts of violence and intimidation. What are your thoughts on how universities have responded to these incidents, and what can we do to balance free speech and campus safety?
Well, I completely agree. This is a major problem. But where there's a glimmer of hope in that is, I think, more people who might be more on the moderate part of the political spectrum, or even those on the left, when they see some of these demonstrations where speakers, and I'm talking about academics and scholars, I'm talking about Christina Hoff Sommers, I'm talking about Charles Murray, people who have significant significant academic credentials, when they're being shouted down on campus, I think it's actually letting those people know who may have thought, well, we understand that colleges and universities are on the left, but that's just the way it is, and that's the way it's always going to be. I think actually a tide is turning now, that people are beginning to think, wow, we're not even allowing people to even speak anymore that have credible points of view. I actually think that people are beginning to get more involved on this set of issues. We just had Charles Murray here speak on campus in March. It was the first time in 10 years of bringing speakers here to Pepperdine that I had to meet with the Department of Public Safety to talk through, if something went down, how are we going to respond to it? And it was really my first direct exposure to the challenges that scholars are having, conservative scholars are having, speaking on college campuses. So the first thing I think we need to do is to continue to encourage and support these conservative academics to speak on campus. I would also say, and I do a fair amount of speaking on other college campuses as well around these issues, is to promote viewpoint diversity and to speak to provosts and those in the senior administration. And while I'm not so supportive of what you might call the bomb throwers on the right, I definitely think that for the academics, the scholars, that there are a number of conservative perspectives there that could really make an impact and need to be welcome onto college campuses, and to hold administrations accountable for the treatment of these scholars and academics who have important things to say and important arguments to make.
One common tactic that I've seen in political debate today is discrediting even the very act of questioning ideas and conclusions that are popular, or things that have become really sacred cows. One example of this would be the debate over climate change. The debate over the science notwithstanding, you see that those who espouse a free market approach to environmentalism are really cast aside with aspersions for merely even suggesting that a heavy-handed government approach is not the only solution, to improve our environment. And this trend goes back to our universities. Ideally, we should be encouraging a spirit of questioning everything. So how do you see, this lack of ideological diversity among our university faculty affecting our American political discourse overall?
Yeah, no, I think it's toxic. And I think you're right, Tim, to point to the fact that some of the challenges that we're seeing in Washington and various state capitals around these policy debates, they originate on college campuses where there haven't been great conversations or civil discourse around these issues. I think at the heart of it, and I think the environmental suite of policy issues is a perfect example of this problem, is that policy solutions are being conflated with the issue itself. And many of the folks that I give a lot of credit to on the right, who may agree with the scientific elements of climate change, but have a different policy response to it. I'm thinking about Bjorn Lomborg and others that are saying, okay, I agree with the science, but I have a different perspective on how we should respond to it from a policy perspective. That's not being allowed. And people who are not sharing I don't want to call it common wisdom because I don't think it's wisdom, but the perceived understanding of what the policy solutions would be. And you're right, these tend to be very heavy-handed, government first, and not just government first, federal government first responses. That if you're not buying not just the science, but also their policy solutions, you are being shouted down and being lumped together with those that even disagree with some of the science around climate change. And so in this, and this is especially where I'm very interested here at a policy school that's preparing policymakers who are taking coursework in environmental policy, that if we're not able to have a debate around responses to these issues, then we're really hurting ourselves, again, as a nation, if we're not able to have a real civil discussion about how we're going to respond to these issues.
So, of course, as someone who ran for statewide office, Secretary of State, we have to talk California politics, especially since the June primary is right around the corner. We know that voter engagement is a key focus of your work. So the 2018 election promises to be one of the most consequential in years in California, with many key races and propositions can be done to increase voter engagement in our democracy.
I certainly do agree. My work around voter engagement and civic engagement more broadly, I found that the political scientists are right. Many years ago, a group of political scientists, in looking at this issue around apathy, created this term rational ignorance, which is a term defined by the fact that most voters, because it's just one vote out of maybe millions cast in a national election or even, of course, a statewide election here in California, because it's only one vote in millions, they make the rational decision not to get involved and to frankly become ignorant of issues related to politics and policy. But I think what we see here, particularly in California, and this race is going to be the governor's race, the statewide race, and certainly some of the ballot issues that you mentioned, Ro. I think in some ways are a demonstration of some of the challenges that we face when we don't address issues at a local level first. Frankly, most of us live in places where we're not one vote in millions, we're one vote in thousands. We just had a little over a year ago, we had a mayor's race here in the city of Los Angeles, one of the largest cities in America, and it was in the low 20% voter turnout. Now, the upside of that is if you're a voter who's actually engaged, your vote means a lot more. And so what I try to encourage voters who might be susceptible to this rational ignorance is to say, well, in the very least, be engaged more locally. And you should be engaged more locally, number one, because issues that are addressed at the local level, whether it be school board elections or council issues or local ordinances, they're going to affect your life much more than, frankly, most of the decisions made in the U.S. Senate race this coming fall. But in the second instance, and we certainly see this particularly in California, if issues are not addressed at the more local level, they become statewide issues and then become national issues pretty quickly. I think many of us have seen now what started off as a sanctuary city issue became a sanctuary state issue, and now we're seeing the cities now responding. But that only happened because in some instances, voters were not immediately engaged in what was happening at the state level and even at the local level. But now, and certainly we're starting to see city after city and even some counties now responding, voters are beginning to understand that if I don't engage on these issues more locally, they could become statewide issues that, because we're California and some people see us as a bellwether, they could become national issues. I think about this discussion around, I was just in Washington, D.C. the last couple of days, and a couple of people I met with were talking about, well, how about this Kamala Harris? Is she going to be the Democratic candidate for presidency in the next cycle? And I thought to myself, back in 2010, she won that first attorney general race by thousands of votes. That was definitely a race where just a couple thousand votes one way or the other, and she doesn't win that first attorney general race, which means chances are she doesn't win that second one. And now, of course, she is now being considered, or some are saying that she should be put forward as a candidate for presidency of the United States. And it all started with a race that was determined by thousands of votes. So again, when I'm speaking especially to California voters, I say, okay, I get it. Maybe on a presidential election, especially if you happen to be on the center right as I am, maybe your vote is not going to make a big difference. But at the local level, and even some of these statewide races, your vote can make a really big difference.
Some have argued that this voter apathy and lack of participation that we're seeing is the result of people losing faith with our electoral institutions, but also elected leaders really at every level of government. What are your thoughts on this? Are years of politicians saying one thing and doing another impacting our democratic process?
I think that's a fair accusation. I also think, as someone who considers himself more as a classical conservative, I think the growth of the administrative state, both at the state level and certainly at the federal level, where you have unelected agency representatives are making decisions that impact the lives of people who frankly did not vote for them. I think those are all serious issues. But again, I would still go back to the fact, and most of the polling does bear this out, that even when you look at levels of trust in governing institutions and see extremely low levels of trust in our federal institutions, there's usually a drop down to levels of trust in our state institutions. But usually at the local government level, you tend to see greater levels of support and trust. And so in that, I think it behooves us all that in the very least, where our vote counts the most, we need to be more engaged at the local level. But I think that is a fair accusation to make. And certainly more recently, in some of the discussions around the president's decision, even those on the left have said about the president that many of the decisions he's making now, whether they are issues around the Iran nuclear deal or North Korea or other issues of a domestic policy perspective, he is attempting to fulfill the promises he made on the campaign trail. And at its best, I hope his presidency continues to demonstrate to others that if they make promises on the campaign trail, if and when they get elected, they need to be about fulfilling those promises.
Despite the lower projected turnout in the midterm elections, we're certainly definitely seeing more engaged political activism in the Trump era, but this increased activism is growing on the far left and the far right, while the broad middle continues to be disengaged. What are your thoughts on this trend? Is it contributing to an unhealthy polarization in our society?
I think it is. And I think specifically this could be seen as happening in California, right? So I think what's happening right now in California politics is when you look at the Democrat and Republican parties, you're seeing a different but similar dynamic at work in which the Democrats have become so strong that I think those on the fringes are beginning to demand policymakers respond to their concerns, right? So you see these issues around the big support for single payer on the left, just here in California. I think certain environmental issues are a part of that as well, that the fringes on the left have begun to say, okay, we waited our time until we got this powerful. Now you in the center need to respond to us. And I think that really sets itself up for a fracturing of the Democratic Party here. On the right, it's an opposite problem, but also similar in the sense that the party, unfortunately, has gotten so small that it's become much more inward looking and much more questioning of who is a real Republican and who isn't. And so, I think the problem is deeper on the left because they happen to be the party in power. But you also have some of those issues of polarization on the right as well.
So I think there's no better way to celebrate our democracy than with a toast. And here on our podcast, with our proximity to various wine countries in California, we always ask our guests at the end for a wine recommendation. So with school out and summer here, how are you celebrating another successful academic year? And perhaps you have a recommendation to help our listeners celebrate summertime as well.
Well, I'm sure many of your listeners are you have some great wine experts in your listening audience. For me, I'm a big fan of cabs and California cabs in particular. I love Round Pond, which is a cab out of the Rutherford area. I also like the Hall wines as well. I tend to be more of a deeper, fruitier, smokier cab fan. And so I think the wines that come out of that Rutherford area are really terrific. So that's where I would celebrate.
Thanks very much, Dean Peterson.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks again to our guest, Dean Peterson, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. To learn more about the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, go to publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu. To visit the PRI website, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. While you're there, check out our blog, Right by the Bay. Also, if you're in the Los Angeles area, we invite you to a luncheon on June 29th with Andy Puzder, former CEO of CKE Restaurants, to discuss his new book, Capitalist Comeback. Details are also on our website. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Marina Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.